consider it when we get around to doing A Christmas Carol.
We could do the motorized version.
I mean, I always like the Christmas Carol's message about the anti-capitalist sort of stuff, you know.
Yeah, there's-
Charles Dickens was a very good observer of his own times. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? My son gave me a piece of money that was used as currency by the British workhouse that was in the area where my grandmother lived. I don't know for a fact whether she worked in that prison. It wouldn't have been my grandmother who worked in it, but if one of my earlier ancestors from Great Britain worked in that workhouse, it would not be at all surprising, because, as Scrooge said, if they'd rather die, let them do so and decrease the surplus population.
And under death's the thing, it was the two children that are under death's club. One was poverty and ignorance. What were the two?
It was poverty and ignorance.
Poverty and ignorance. And I
And
thought,
most of all, fear ignorance.
right. And what was the title of this lecture? You said last week it was what?
It is 6 flights, 6 lies.
6 flights.
Flights, F-L-I-G-H-T-S.
Okay.
But actually, because of what's been happening in the last several weeks, I'm going to expand it, and you're going to want to discuss aspects of it, because what's been happening in the last 3 or 4 weeks since the election is just really nutty. And it's with respect to what's been happening in the last 3 or 4 weeks, that is why I have titled this A Time of Madness. Let's do the slideshow. You show, that's what we want. Six flights, 6 lines. Lord Acton said that power tends to corrupt, and it's interesting. The accurate quotation is, power tends to corrupt. But when he gets to the absolute power, he says, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Every once in a while, you can get a simple, fundamental, profound truth in a few words. Lord Acton got one of them, and Howard Zinn got another. Governments lie. When we look at these 6 aircraft flights, I'm going to, on several occasions, appeal to the curious incident of the dog in the night. You remember that Sherlock Holmes story? Where the reality that the dog didn't bark suggested that the dog knew the intruder. Ergo, you're looking at things that should have happened and didn't. In a corollary circumstance, there are a number of things that shouldn't happen and did. So in both of those circumstances, I'm going to suggest that your critical faculty should say, that smells like old fish. And I've noticed in all sorts of argumentation against all sorts of conspiracies, the argument is made that, for example, someone would have talked. That's an a priori assumption. It comes out of thin air. It comes out of an intrinsic resistance to the possibility that the conspiracy actually is true. Now, everyone starts out with a bias. I think it was Jung who said that a child, the most important lesson a child learns in his or her first 2 years of life is whether to trust the world or not. And so they start out, after those 2 years, for better and for worse, they either are intrinsically trustful or intrinsically skeptical. Now, a certain form of trustfulness is absolutely desirable in human beings. I want to be able to trust you when you tell me something, and you want to be able to trust me when I tell you something. On the other hand, if a third party tells me something that is inconsistent, A, with what I know, or B, with the world that I have discovered, I should be appropriately skeptical and weigh it. It was Aristotle who said, it is the mark of an intelligent, educated person that can hold an idea in his or her mind and examine it from multiple perspectives without basically believing it. It's the mark of an educated person who can hold an idea, come to understand it, without necessarily embracing it. On the other hand, when Walter Cronkite told my generation, or whoever is the person on television tells you something, the goal of the media is for that to pass right around your critical faculty and for you to accept it as fact. And in point of fact, the American media has been remarkably successful at that. But we are no longer children, and unfortunately people do occasionally lie to us, and people with motivation to lie to us need to be considered as intrinsically unbelievable rather than intrinsically believable. Ergo, Howard Zinn, governments lie. After we look at these 6 flights, we're going to look at a number of things that are pertinent over the last month and the principles of skepticism that come out of these 6 flights. In May of 1960, Francis Gary Powers flew a U-2 flight over the Soviet Union. He was forced down. Now, some people say he was shot down, and many of the videos you will see will imitate the shooting down of the U-2 flight. However, the other reports, much more reliable reports, suggest that Francis Gary Powers was forced down while flying at an altitude that the Soviet aircraft could reach. What's important for you to understand about the U-2 flights is that they have been going on for several years. They were basically a cooperative arrangement between the United States Air Force and the CIA, and the U-2 was a remarkably gifted aircraft, if I may put it that way, because it was capable of flying something like 80,000 feet. I might be off by 10,000, but it's at least 80,000, and it may have been 90,000. And big aircraft couldn't get above 50,000. So there was no way on God's green earth that the Soviet Union was going to be able to shoot down. And I will tell you that the Soviets were furious. They knew the U.S. was overflying their territory. They knew they were taking photographs of very sensitive areas, and there was not a thing they could do about it. They were absolutely furious. Dwight David Eisenhower, as his parting gesture to the world, was conducting a crusade for peace the last couple months of his presidency of 1960. And during this crusade for peace, where he was touring many countries of the world, including a planned visit to the Soviet Union, the order came down from the president, from the office of the president, no U-2 flights, no overflights, while I'm conducting this crusade. And L. Fletcher Prouty shares this information with us, and L. Fletcher Prouty was in close communication with the CIA that was actually conducting the overflights. While Eisenhower was on this tour, but before he had gotten to the Soviet Union, an unauthorized U-2 flight took off from, if I recall correctly, India. Interesting thing about the aircraft that Francis Gary Powers was using was that it had landed in a somewhat unplanned fashion earlier in Japan, and in the process of doing the repairs on this particular aircraft, the high-class, ultra-sophisticated camera was removed from it, and a much more conventional camera, much less expensive and much less secret, was installed in the U-2 flight instead of the ultra-classified camera. So Francis Gary Powers, in fact, I'm confident Powers did not know that his camera had been switched. Neither did he know. Now, it was one of the policies for these spies, because technically they were spies, flying over the Soviet Union to have no personal identification on them. No wallets, no keys, no driver's license, no nothing, okay? They were examined briefly by a flight surgeon. They were put into a totally anonymous flight suit. And when I say anonymous, I mean there was no identification of the origin of the flight suit in terms of material, webbing, stitching, nothing. And the guy who got into it got into it naked or with his undershorts on. Have to absorb the perspiration somehow. When Powers was halfway, another thing you need to know before I finish the story is that because the U-2 flew so high, its ordinary aviation fuel was supplemented with compressed hydrogen. It's a little bottle of compressed gas that was used to supplement. When Francis Gary Powers was flying over the Soviet Union, about midway in his flight, his hydrogen tank went out. And the U-2 could not fly at high altitude without that hydrogen. So what he had to do was come down to about 50,000 feet, where his aircraft fuel would be sufficient to restart the engine. He wouldn't be able to fly at the high altitude, but he'd be able to, at least to fly. Well, when Francis Gary Powers got down to that altitude and restarted his engine, he had a lot of company. And his company was in the form of MiGs, and the MiGs gently told him that he had one of two ways of getting on the ground, voluntarily and involuntarily. So he got his plane on the ground, and when he got out of his U-2, he found to his complete surprise that he had rings that he was supposed to use as bribery, he had Russian money, he had all sorts of identification that would tell his captors where he came from. Basically, he was sacrificed for the goal of a political purpose to the Soviets. Nikita Khrushchev released the information that the U-2 had crashed, and the initial assumption in the United States of the two factors. The people who ran the U-2 program, according to L. Fletcher Prouty, were terrified because they didn't even know one of their planes was in the air. The initial announcement was that this was a weather flight that had gone off course and it was not a spy plane. It was at that point in time that Khrushchev revealed that we have the pilot and we have the plane and we have his identification. It was at that point that Dwight David Eisenhower had to admit that it was indeed a U.S. spy flight, and it absolutely soured, I mean incredibly soured, the relationship between Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. Now I want to point out that that was not Eisenhower's plan. Eisenhower's plan was to leave office with at least somewhat good relationships with the Soviet Union. It probably reflects a pre-assassination effort of the deep state to make sure that the United States and the Soviet Union remained hostile enemies rather than cooperative partners. Eisenhower chose not to lie, and you can say that was wise or unwise, but it's absolutely clear that Eisenhower was deceived by his own government, and it's absolutely clear that those persons in government were intending to make sure that the Soviet Union and the United States remained hostile enemies. Questions?
I'm remembering Adlai Stevenson being involved as the representative to the UN. Was he not lied to so that he ended up?
Are you sure you're not thinking of, I think you're thinking of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
No.
No? Okay.
No.
I don't, the short answer is I don't recall that aspect of it.
Saying I am prepared to wait until hell freezes over.
I'm sorry?
I said I remember the line being quoted that Adlai Stevenson said I am prepared to wait till hell freezes over.
And that's
That
why I
was
think
in
you're
the
thinking
UN.
about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
No, it was not. It was Gary Palmer. Stevenson ran for president in
56.
56, and so he would have been around to be.
Oh, he was definitely around.
Representative to the
He
UN.
was definitely
He was a
around.
representative to the
but
UN.
I-
believe denied that Powers was a spy.
Go back and check it. I
Okay.
would like to lay a 25-cent bet on you that you're remembering the Cuban Missile
I
Crisis.
remember the Cuban Missile Crisis quite well, and I don't recall that Adlai Stevenson
Okay.
had anything to do with it whatsoever, but I will look this up.
I respect your
And you can keep
recollection
your
on
2
that.
bits.
Pardon?
I said you can keep your 2 bits, but I will look it up.
In December of 1972, we were in the midst of the Watergate scandal, and Nixon was fighting for his life. And a flight carrying Dorothy Hunt and a number of other people involved in the Watergate scandal were on flight number 553 from, I want to say Washington, but I'm not sure of that, to Midway Airport in Chicago. It was due to land about 2:30 in the afternoon, relatively snowy, but it was not actively snowing at the time, and the ceiling was about 500 feet. So low ceiling, but not impossibly low. It was assigned to, I'll call it runway A because I don't remember the exact number. Runway A, and another aircraft was a little ways in front of 553, and because of the proximity, Flight 553 was waved off when it was down at about 300 feet. But this wave off, that is, it was told to go around again because it would have been landing too close in the tailwind of the flight in front of it. And either the pilot or co-pilot confirmed receipt of those instructions, and at about that time, it supposedly crashed. By crashed, I mean it hit trees and houses a couple miles east of Midway Airport. Now, the reason I say supposedly is witnesses from the outside declare that what they heard in the engines and what they saw of the aircraft came down at an appropriate flight angle, and because of its rapid rate of descent, had leveled itself out from a descent position and increased engine power, but not in a frantic fashion. But the last few seconds of its flight, the outside witnesses say that it had an absurd bank, the kind of bank that a student pilot might impose, because it's the kind of aircraft deviation that no one in their right mind with pilot training would do, because it's guaranteed to stall the aircraft. And either it stalled or it was destroyed by sabotage from within, and I don't know the answer to that. And the flight data recorder was not retrieved. Now, Dorothy Hunt died in that. The dog that didn't bark are these factors involved. The FBI was on the scene within moments, I didn't say minutes, I said moments of the flight hitting the ground. And the 15 or so survivors saw these, I'll call them FBI types. They clearly had a mission of finding something in the aircraft, and they clearly weren't there to rescue survivors. And a number of people commented on their presence. The FBI went directly to the Midway Tower and confiscated the tape recordings of the tower communications with the aircraft. And in addition, although the aircraft was destroyed within 200 feet of the ground, the flight data recorder was unserviceable. Now, we don't know whether it was damaged, supposedly damaged in the crash, or whether, quote, it was unserviceable when it took off. In either case, the immediate presence of the FBI, the confiscation of the tower tape, and the non-functionality of the flight data recorder are dogs that didn't bark. Now, I cannot tell you who was being murdered on Flight 553. I can tell you with a rational level of confidence that someone was being murdered. And the probability is that it was Dorothy Hunt. The probability is that it was a warning to Howard Hunt to keep his mouth shut, because Howard Hunt had information connecting Richard Nixon, not with Watergate, but with the assassination of John F. Kennedy 10 years previously, 12 years previously. As I say, I cannot tell you who was being murdered or why. I can tell you that the deep state knew that it was going to take place and wanted to retrieve something. It might have been the 10 grand that Dorothy Hunt was carrying. It might have been something else. But the deep state had no difficulty whatsoever murdering 60-some people, actually 45 died, in order to accomplish their purpose.
Didn't it just come out that Howard Hunt was down in Texas at the time?
That was one of the speculations. You mean at the point in time
Yeah, that just came out recently that he was down there or something.
that is, I have not looked at it close enough to say that that is fact. I can agree with you that it is certainly in the discussion period. Each of these items, obviously, is material for a whole lot more study. If one of you takes up one of these subjects and comes back on another occasion and says, here's the rest of the story, no one will be better pleased than I. Flight KE 007, 1983. A Korean Airlines flight 007 took off from an airport in Alaska, but I cannot say with certainty if it was Anchorage, bound for Japan. For reasons that are somewhat unclear, it was flying on a compass heading that took it directly over very sensitive Soviet territory. It was not flying on what you would call a straight aviation line from the point of departure to Japan. It was flying on a straight compass setting, but it was not flying on a straight line type of setting. When it got over and did not, now it was flying at night, so it was virtually impossible to identify it externally. It would have to have been identified by markings and or radio communication. A Soviet aircraft was sent up to determine its identity and to tell it to get the hell out of there. And the nature of the communication is at best unclear. Radio conversations monitored from outside clearly indicate that the Soviet pilot made multiple attempts to communicate with this aircraft and failed to do so. I will say as an aside, in 1983, civilian aircraft of the United States and civilian aircraft of the Soviet Union had been fitted with cameras in the event that they were going to be flying over sensitive territory, so that a civilian airliner could in fact be on a spying mission as well as being a commercial aircraft. Both major powers were doing it. Both major powers knew that the other one was doing it. The Soviet pilot, after making multiple attempts to communicate, was given the order, since they were flying over an area that was super sensitive for the Soviets. The Soviet pilot was given the orders to shoot the aircraft down. The Soviet pilot did so. The flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder were recovered by the Soviets. Remarkably little of the aircraft itself was recovered, which led to some speculation that the aircraft might have survived the missile attack and landed at the sensitive Soviet site. I don't personally follow that, but it is an avenue that if you go to pursue it, you may come to the conclusion that the passengers survived but were confiscated, were seized by the Soviet Union. I'm going to play for you something that Ronald Reagan, having his people monitor the radio communications between the MiG pilot and the Korean airliner, knew was at most, or at worst, an accident. It was not an act of murder, it was an act of national self-defense. If you've got an unidentified aircraft flying over a sensitive area, that's an enemy aircraft. This is what Ronald Reagan had to say about it.
I'm calling further tonight about the Korean airline massacre, the attack by the Soviet Union against 269 innocent men, women, and children aboard an unarmed Korean passenger plane. This crime against humanity must never be forgotten, here or throughout the world. Our prayers tonight are with the victims and their families in their time of terrible grief. Our hearts go out to them, to brave people like Catherine McDonald, the wife of a congressman whose composure and eloquence on the day of her husband's death moved us all. He will be sorely missed by all of us here in government. The parents of one slain couple wired me. Our daughter and her husband died on Korean Airline Flight 007. Their deaths were the result of the Soviet Union violating every concept of human rights. The emotions of these parents, grief, shock, anger, are shared by civilized people everywhere. From around the world, press accounts reflect an explosion of condemnation by people everywhere. Let me state as plainly as I can, there was absolutely no justification, either legal or moral, for what the Soviets did. One newspaper in India said, If every passenger plane is fair game for home air forces, it will be the end to civil aviation as we know it. This is not the first time the Soviet Union has shot at and hit a civilian airliner when it overflew its territory. In another tragic incident in 1978, the Soviets also shot down an unarmed civilian airliner after having positively identified it as such. In that instance, the Soviet interceptor pilot clearly identified the civilian markings on the side of the aircraft, repeatedly questioned the order to fire on the civilian airliner, and was ordered to shoot it down anyway. The aircraft was hit with a missile and made a crash landing. Several innocent people lost their lives in this attack, killed by shrapnel from the blast of a Soviet missile. Is this a practice of other countries in the world? The answer is no. Commercial aircraft from the Soviet Union and Cuba, on a number of occasions, have overflown sensitive United States military facilities. They weren't shot down.
What was the purpose of Reagan's announcement?
Keep the Cold War going.
Come on now. This is so irritating. I think it's fairly obvious that Reagan was using this tragedy as a propaganda device. He knew that it was an accident. It may, because civilian aircraft were being used as spy planes under certain circumstances, it may in fact have been a spy aircraft. But it has been the practice to make our enemies the bad guys and portray the United States and its allies as never the aggressor and never the bad guys, but always the good guys. And if you buy into that, you ought to buy comic books, but don't buy the New York Times anyway. But the point is made. The next flight is flight TWA 800. Flight TWA 800 was a Boeing 747 which had taken off from, I think, Kennedy Airport on its way to Paris. It had reached about 11 or 12,000 feet when, according to official reports, it exploded in midair, broke into 2 or more pieces, fell into the Atlantic Ocean, and the FBI spent 2 years reconstructing that aircraft in a confiscated hangar. The FBI, I'm emphasizing that because remember the dog that didn't bark? The FBI interviewed citizens along Long Island as to what they saw, because the accident or the incident took place after nightfall along a heavily inhabited area of land. Many of those persons described fairly accurately what would have been observed if a missile had arisen out of the sea and hit TWA 800 and the aircraft had broken up in air and fallen to the sea. However, the FBI and the National Transportation Safety Board came to the conclusion that a partially empty center fuel tank had exploded because of the vapors of basically kerosene had exploded and caused the aircraft to break up in air and subsequently fall to the ground. It's been the subject of a number of documentaries, and I would call your attention, each of these, by the way, with the possible exception of Flight 553, are subject to documentaries. I'd encourage you. On 800, the title is Silenced, TWA 800. And it's well worth going over. It is a classic demonstration of how you conduct an investigation with the intention of not finding out what is really going on. The many, many witnesses that offered their testimony were either listened to but not recorded, or not even bothered to be listened to. They arrived at a conclusion like 9/11. They arrived at conclusions, no, I wanted to make a comparison with Pan Am 103. With respect to TWA 800, what is absolutely clear is that the witnesses, both those in official position but who could not possibly comment on the record about it, and the witnesses who viewed the catastrophe from the ground, saw an aircraft being destroyed by a missile. What was denied initially was that there were no craft in the water in that vicinity. Since radar identified at least one craft in the water that was large enough to be picked up on aviation radar, the authorities, and I'm not sure if this was NTSB or FBI, agreed that there was fairly accurately what would have been observed if a missile had arisen out of the sea and hit TWA 800, and the aircraft had broken up in air and fallen to the sea. However, the FBI and the National Transportation Safety Board came to the conclusion that a partially empty centered fuel tank had exploded because of the vapors of basically kerosene had exploded and caused the aircraft to break up in air and subsequently fall to the ground. It's been the subject of a number of documentaries, and I would call your attention, each of these, by the way, with the possible exception of Flight 553, are subject to documentaries. I'd encourage you. On 800, the title is Silenced, TWA 800, and it's well worth going over. It is a classic demonstration of how you conduct an investigation with the intention of not finding out what is really going on. The many, many witnesses that offered their testimony were either listened to but not recorded, or not even bothered to be listened to. They arrived at a conclusion like 9/11. They arrived at conclusions, no, I wanted to make a comparison with Pan Am 103. With respect to TWA 800, what is absolutely clear is that the witnesses, both those in official position but who could not possibly comment on the record about it, and the witnesses who viewed the catastrophe from the ground, saw an aircraft being destroyed by a missile. What was denied initially was that there were no craft in the water in that vicinity. Since radar identified at least one craft in the water that was large enough to be picked up on aviation radar, the authorities, and I'm not sure if this was NTSB or FBI, agreed that there was a watercraft going northward from close to, in proximity to the accident site, but that they had no connection. It did not know how to identify it. It did not identify it. It only came out at a competency hearing for Susan Lindauer that 3 American vessels were in fact in the area 2 of them, I believe, were submarines, and that flight TWA-800 had been downed accidentally by a missile fired from one of these naval vessels. Lindauer is a reliable witness, but unfortunately she has also been contaminated in the sense that there are occasions on which she was given bad information. She is not the source of bad information, but if she is given bad information and shares it, you're getting bad information from a good witness. In the case of disinformation, it was not given by Lindauer, it was given by someone giving evidence on Lindauer's behalf at her competency hearing. Lindauer's basic crime was having information that 9/11 was going to take place, and her superiors in the CIA had been warning their personnel of a major terrorist attack on the United States coming up in late summer, early fall of 2001. Her crime in terms of the Bush administration was saying people knew the attack was coming. They may not have known when, they may not have known exactly where, although the suspicion was that it was going to involve A, aircraft, and B, the World Trade Centers. She said that shortly after the attacks on 9/11, and for that reason, either Bush or the deep state, or both, decided she needed to be silenced. So, she was charged with a number of crimes and, quote, found to be unfit to face trial, unquote. That is, some court psychiatrist was told to tell the court that she was not capable of facing trial. She was not emotionally and intellectually capable of facing trial. Her competency hearing demonstrated that she was more than competent to face trial. She had multiple character witnesses saying the lady knows what she's talking about. And it was either a few days after Bush left office or a few days before Bush left office that all charges against Susan Lindauer were dropped. So, whatever her crime was, it disappeared as soon as George Bush left office.
What year was this one?
TWA-800 was 1996. And one of the cover stories, and I need to tell you about cover stories. L. Fletcher Prouty tells us that there was a specific department in the CIA to produce a multitude of cover stories. If the CIA was going to do an Operation A, then publicity people in the CIA would float not one, but 2 or 3 cover stories in order to provide a plausible explanation for what happened in the operation. And it didn't really matter, you know, when I went through this, when I went through some of these plausible stories, it's absolutely amazing. It's kind of like the little boy going through an old barn, knowing that there's got to be a pony there because there's so much horse shit. And distinguishing between the information and the false stories requires both judgment and a sound, having your head screwed on rather straight. But I wanted you to know about the false stories because when you get to do some of these studies, you will find a false trail in this direction and a fake trail in this direction and a misleading trail in that direction. And I advise you to look at them carefully and decide whether it's worth going down that trail, because most of them are these cover stories created by some office in the CIA. And that comes to mind because one of the false stories about the destruction of TWA-800 was that the missile that was released from the naval vessel was intended to destroy a small aircraft that was going to attack TWA-800. In other words, it was the first American defense against a terrorist attack. Now, that would be humorous if it weren't so tragic, but since every single major terrorist attack in the Western world has been basically a false flag attack, I'm not talking about minor ones like Virginia Tech, etc. I'm talking about major ones like Nice and Paris and 9/11 and etc. Every one of those were engineered by the deep state, or some players in the deep state, saying that some terrorists were out to attack TWA-800 doesn't pass the giggle test. I remember what film this is now. Come on.
TWA is such a family that for a family to lose 53 members of its immediate family was devastating, not just for me, but for everybody in TWA. Everyone else, just, everyone. We just walked around kind of in shock, thinking, how could this happen? 53 of us are gone.
I was angry. I was angry because I felt betrayed by TWA. I was angry because my brother was gone. I was angry because I was finding out how many people that I knew, flight attendants, active, retired, were on that flight. I was just pretty angry. And I had firmly believed, I had seen that night a short clip of what appeared to be a missile on the radar screen on CNN heading towards the flight. So I firmly believed, and still do, that a missile took down that plane.
We like to think that in America, those who seek the truth will be respected, even honored. But in the case of TWA Flight 800, those who did were ignored, even reviled. This program will tell you why. To preserve its integrity, we use raw footage from various sources of varying quality. We thank you for your forbearance, and we thank those who, despite the costs, have never failed to seek the truth. On the evening of July 17, 1996 at 8:19 p.m., TWA Flight 800, a Boeing 747, took off from Kennedy Airport bound for Paris. It headed east without incident in fair skies along the south coast of Long Island. About 8:30 p.m., Mike Wire, a mechanic, saw a streak of light rise up from behind the house and head south-southeast away from shore. At the same time, Dwight Brumley, a senior Navy NCO on board US Air Flight 217, watched a streak of light rise up towards his plane before leveling off and heading north towards Long Island. Lisa Perry from her Fire Island deck and Paul Angelides from his on West Hampton both followed the southbound streak towards eastbound Flight 800, and then each saw the northbound streak rise off the horizon at the last moment. At 8:31, FAA radar operators saw an unknown object streak up and merge with Flight 800. This they reported to the highest authorities. turned up something else unusual.
There was a ship directly beneath Flight 100 when it crashed. We know very little about this ship. The government tells us they have not been able to identify that ship, although the government says they didn't even notice it for 6 months into the investigation, although it was tracked by aircraft radar. We know it was traveling away from the scene rather than towards it. Didn't help in search and rescue. It's traveling very fast. It's likely very large since, aircraft radar picked it up.
The interesting thing about that report is that subsequently the federal government admitted that there were 3 vessels and only 1 identified on radar, and the report is, or the supposition is, that the other 2 were submarines and therefore disappeared below the surface. As best I can tell, the primary reason for the FBI being involved in that is that nobody wanted to admit that the Navy had made that kind of mistake. In other words, we've painted the United States as the good guys and the opposition as the bad guys, and yet the good guys just killed 250 plus people on an American airliner. And as best I can tell, that's the only reason for this flagrant lie. And yet they put a lot of resources into carrying out this lie, and as you can tell, the only reason it fell apart is that the witnesses refused to shut their mouths. Pan Am 103 and the bombers who weren't. Let's see what comes up here. I'll tell you a bit about 103 after the split.
With some others from the UK Families group, I met the American President's Commission on Aviation Security and Terrorism at the American Embassy. That was in February 1990. And at the end of that meeting, after we'd broken up, one of the members of the commission said to me, "Your government and ours know exactly what happened, but they're never going to tell." In the beginning, a hand, a bag, and a baggage tag. And a radio that plays cassettes and has its own flip side, a bomb.
And the story of Pan Am 103 is interesting from a number of respects. And in order to understand it in context, we have to look at 6 months before 103 was destroyed in midair. 6 months before that, Iraq was at war with Iran, and Iraq had started that war, and U.S. warships were cruising in, what is that, the name of that sea between Arabia and Iran? The Persian Gulf. Thank you. Sometimes the words do come back to me. The USS Vincennes, which was, if I recall correctly, a destroyer, was cruising, and for reasons that are totally unclear, other than pure malice, but I'm not going to attribute that without evidence, I think it was a 747, Iranian 747, was taking off from an Iranian airport to at the southern portion of the Persian Gulf, was on a normal flight path, and the USS Vincennes sent a missile out that destroyed that aircraft. Again, something like 250 persons dying. The captain of the Vincennes said he thought it was a fighter and that he may have been under attack, which is a breathtaking thing for a captain of a naval vessel to say when you're looking at a naval airliner. There is no chance on God's green earth that the radar signal of an airliner is going to look like a military attack aircraft. Just ain't gonna happen. United States did not apologize for this, and the crew of the Vincennes received congratulatory notices, and the captain received a medal for valorous conduct in the execution of his duties. And everyone in the intelligence community at that point knew that Iran was going to find a way of retaliating. They just knew that Iran was not going to take that kind of murder of its citizens for granted. Now, there were 2 Libyans who were accused of planting the bomb in Pan Am 103. A great deal of irrelevant data was brought forth to convict him and to convict them, and the only people who thought they were guilty were the people involved in their prosecution. The film entitled Double Cross. I will tell you the name of the film after I get off of this PowerPoint. It's a double cross, and we'll let it go. I will tell you the title in a few minutes. But it is the story of Pan Am 103 as investigated by Libyan investigators. Now, ordinarily, you would say that such a documentary would be subject to all kinds of questions because Libyans were accused of the attack. However, the same Susan Lindauer that I mentioned earlier, at her competency hearing, it was admitted by CIA personnel that it was Iran sponsoring the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Office that was responsible for the attack on 103. It was an act of retaliation against the action of the Vincennes, and Iran hired the PFLP to plant a bomb, and the Libyan investigators, interestingly enough, were able to find some of the parties involved in planting the bomb in Germany on Pan Am 103. If you go to that documentary, whose name I will give you shortly, you'll see the whole 2-hour documentary, and precisely because we know the Libyans didn't do it, I'm willing to believe what the Libyan documentaries are telling you about it. A number of interesting facts are that the way the federal government connected Libya with it was finding a microchip in the swamps of Scotland 2 years after the crash of 103. It's one of those miraculous finds when you start to question miracles. Let me put it that way. That and the evidence attributed in the documentary clearly shows that Iran was retaliating, that they had contacts with the PFLP, they had contacts with terrorists who were willing to do the job, and they succeeded in doing the job. And the only way they could pin it on the Libyans was by creating a suitcase that magically escaped detection in Germany, and that exploded at something like 20,000 feet over Scotland. The long and short of it is that a multitude of agencies, such as the CIA, the Mossad, the MI6, they had personnel, incidental personnel, who were traveling on Flight 103. Without exception, well, I can't say that. The vast majority of them, because the network among intelligence agencies was so good, the vast majority of them changed their reservations at the last minute. Flight 103, which should have been jammed with Christmas travelers, was half empty. It didn't have any personnel from any of the agencies I've mentioned. They got out. The very same agencies chose not to reveal their information about the bomb because they did not want to reveal the fact that they had penetrated the agencies involved in carrying out the attack. So it was worth the intelligence agencies to have something like 150 people, 170 people die in order to not reveal the fact that they had penetrated the PFLP and Iranian secret services. The reason I attached this second film, this is Reagan bragging about an attack that he carried out subsequently on Libyan facilities. And one of the reasons I wanted you to know about this is that the reason Libyan quote, terrorists were accused of the Pan Am attack is precisely because A, the United States did not want to blame Iran, because if they had blamed Iran, the fact that it was a retaliation would come out. And B, they wanted to make the public aware that our new terrorist enemy was Libya. It's a matter of painting one guy in black in order to avoid admitting that we had precipitated the retaliation attack, and B, there were other things that they wanted to do with Gaddafi. Gaddafi was doing all kinds of things that were objectionable to the deep state, and Gaddafi had to be made the bad guy.
Tonight's action will ring down the curtain.
MH17, the plane that Ukrainians didn't shoot down. Did I attach any films with this? I don't recall.
Yes. At this stage, there are still many questions, if not more, than there were before. You have a very different account of events. You have the Russian and the Dutch versions that are contradictory from each other. The first is in terms of the launch site, and here the Russians and the Dutch point to different locations. You then have the origin of the book system. Now, according to the Dutch investigators, it originated in Russia, but according to Russia's book manufacturer, this type of missile that hit MH17 is not used in Russia. It has been decommissioned, and in fact this was found out according to its own experiments that it conducted. There is also a problem with the witnesses that the Dutch investigators used. Firstly, no names were given. Secondly, no interviews were presented, and all the alleged telephone conversations that happened between these so-called rebels in eastern Ukraine were intercepted by the Ukrainian intelligence, which obviously is not a neutral party in the whole affair. It's also important to note that the United States handed over satellite imagery. None of this was shown. Instead, what was used was social media and various videos from social media.
That report is not all that easy to follow, so I will give you a few summary facts. In 2014, in February of 2014, the United States sponsored a coup d'etat in the government of Ukraine in Kiev. The new government was very hostile towards Russia, whereas the previous government was headed by Poroshenko, who was relatively favorably disposed in dealing with Russia. The southeastern inhabitants of Ukraine were vigorously opposed to the new government and refused to recognize its validity, and were attacked and defended themselves. They were attacked by the Kiev government's forces, and they defended themselves. And that defense was supported by Russia, but Russia itself was not involved in the war. In July of the same year, Malaysian Flight MH17 was flying over Ukraine, was under the control of the Kiev Air Control, and was routed over an area of active fighting. The ordinary flight path would have been substantially north of where it was actually flying, and for reasons that are totally unclear, the Kiev Air Control had them fly substantially further south, which was over an active military zone. Over that active military zone, the United States had satellites up the wazoo monitoring what was going on, as did the Russians. Everyone was listening to everything. And after the MH17 was down, the Russians released to the press and for general understanding their radar information, which showed a small aircraft, presumably a military aircraft, trailing MH17. I don't recall whether it showed a missile track or not, but it showed all the evidence that can confirm that the aircraft was destroyed over territory that was controlled by the forces of Kiev, but it fell in territory controlled by the rebels. The Kiev government released social media strongly suggesting that it was rebels who had downed the aircraft, which was flying at something like 33,000 feet. Now, the man pads, which were available to the rebels, can't accomplish anything like that. So we are talking about either a buck missile or an aircraft downing that flight. The television reporter demonstrated the number of dogs that don't bark in terms of the inconsistencies between Kiev's information and the information available from Russian telemetry. The short of it is that Kiev had everything to gain by being able to paint Russia as an aggressor, and the rebels, those who refused to accept Kiev's authority, had absolutely nothing to gain by shooting down a commercial airliner. Subsequently, the Netherlands, France, Ukraine investigators, and Malaysian investigators reached an agreement, A, to study the data about the destruction of MH17, and very interestingly, agreed that any one of those 4 investigation teams could veto the decision and the release of information. In other words, any one of the 4 could veto A, the decision, and B, the release of information. Now, that's kind of like giving Al Capone the ability to contradict the information that is available in the press about him at a trial, because the government of Ukraine was one of the entities suspected of shooting down MH17. This reporter says that the United States gave their radar and telemetry data to the government, to the investigation committee. If they did, it is totally private. It's never been released to the public. Since Russia did release their radar and telemetry data, and we know they had it, and the United States, we know they have that data because they were monitoring the area extensively, they didn't release their information to the public. I'm going to suggest to you that in addition to motivation, the dog that doesn't bark is the failure to get that information. Kiev had everything to gain by downing that aircraft and blaming it on Russia. So what I intended to communicate today was that air crashes are unique opportunities for the dispersion of propaganda. And any air crash that has political ramifications needs to be looked at with considerable skepticism and paying attention to what is normal procedure and what actually happened. Which is why I say the release of information or the failure of release of information by the United States government is a very, very quiet dog. It's past our 3 o'clock hour, but something's been happening in the last 4 weeks that is absolutely astonishing. And I hope you always feel free to question or raise questions. But I want to make this a discussion. We are looking at a unique situation in our time. Let me try one other thing. I might have, oh no, I thought I had. James Corbett has a little discussion about how odd our times are. Let me point out, the national media was basically in a febrile fit to convince you that Donald Trump was unfit for office and that Hillary Clinton was the best thing since Jesus Christ. This was before November 8th. After November 8th, and the Democrats finished crying. Now, I have no great love for Donald Trump, but I'm looking at the political scene, and I'm inviting you to do the same thing with me. After November 8th, typical colored revolution riots broke out in several cities in the United States. Exactly the same thing you saw in Alexandria, in Cairo, and in the cities of Libya. Basically, George Soros sponsored unrest. A couple weeks after that, see if I can go back to this. I'm going to go down to here. There's a long list of very curious circumstances that require, yeah.
Even in Iowa City, right?
Which ones are you referring to?
Right after Trump was elected, the students were doing some.
That I wasn't, that.
Yeah, they closed down the interstate, 80,
Yeah, they went,
20 minutes.
they shut down
Oh, right,
Interstate
they shut
80
down the interstate.
for 20 minutes, yeah.
But at least they didn't break anything.
Okay.
But now we have the press and the Democratic Party attempting to subvert the electoral process. We have an active program by the CIA and at least elements. People are saying it's the Democratic Party. I don't really believe that. Jill Stein was financed by a robot. In the span of less than a week, she raised something like 4 or 5 times the amount of money for her entire campaign she raised in order to challenge the vote counts in 4 states. And I say it was done by a robot because when, in the United States, when is the least likely time of day - night for persons to contribute to any kind of campaign? When do you sleep? When do you sleep? Between the hours of 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., the only people who are awake are the people, A, who work the night shift, or B, the ones who have some kind of problem and they can't sleep. This robot, when you look at the time of day that Jill Stein and the Green Party got their monies, the robot didn't sleep. The robot gave X number of dollars from 10 to 11, the same X from 11 to 12, the same X from 12 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. That's not a human being contributing to the Green Party's recount effort. That's a robot that's been programmed to give a certain amount of money. Now, Why would the Green Party or Jill Stein want a recount? None of those recounts would affect whether Jill Stein and the Green Party achieved any source of power. In fact, I will tell you that in my eyes, the Green Party has been smudged badly. It has been discredited because it has been shown to be an instrument of the deep state. It's a useful puppet, just like the Democratic Party has been a useful puppet, and for the most part, the Republican Party has been a useful puppet. And the last guy who ran a third-party campaign was a dangerous puppet, and therefore he had to be voted down. The point that I'm making is that there is a concerted effort, at least to delegitimize Donald Trump's presidency, and I think, and this is my speculation, I think there is an effort to get the American people to accept non-democratic forms of democratic change. If they succeed in getting the Electoral College to elect Hillary Clinton, that will be a non-democratic way of changing the government system in the United States. Now, in terms of fake news, I want to point out that Prop or Not is basically an anonymous website that is spreading the information. And this information has been picked up by the Washington Post, New York Times, pundits all over the place. Is spreading the news that 200 websites are Russian propaganda websites. Now, those Russian propaganda websites are not abc.com. They are not cnbc.com. They are paulcraigroberts.org. They are informationclearinghouse.info. In fact, I used that 200 list to find out some other useful sources. Because all of the, no, that's an overstatement. Many of those 200 sources are the best sources for information that is actually true. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the television media has been lying, if it had teeth, through its teeth, about Vladimir Putin, about Aleppo, about Bashar al-Assad, about the situation in Eastern Europe, and about Ukraine, and about the potential conflict with China. It is the fake news sources that are accusing other news sources of being fake. I don't know whether they have lost their minds or whether they simply have failed to realize that at least the middle part of the country isn't following them. They should have realized that when Donald Trump got the votes of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania. But somehow the major news networks seem to be totally out of touch with where a lot of the American people are. And I genuinely think there's a program on board to get the Americans to seriously entertain non-democratic change. After all, the Nazis entertained, or the German people entertained non-democratic change when Adolf Hitler in 1933 abolished all of the competing parties. So it's going to be an interesting few months.
Well, is this new? I mean, what about the Supreme Court appointing Wood?
Your point is very well taken.
Hasn't that had undemocratic processes already?
I'm delighted you brought that up, for the reason that you're absolutely right. There have been non-democratic parties, non-democratic principles employed in the past. The interesting thing about this situation is that in the year 2000, nobody said boo about that non-democratic process.
Exactly.
In 2016, they're working on fomenting a non-democratic process. They can't get the Supreme Court to do it for them, So they're trying to get the Electoral College to do it for them. That's a great example of when the deep state was in collusion with the Supreme Court. The deep state is doing its very best to find a way of subverting Donald Trump's presidency. And maybe,
Well, I hope they're successful, frankly.
well, I
And
don't.
I'm not a Hillary fan by any means.
Well, I don't, because I've told friends from before the election until now, I don't know what to expect from a Trump presidency, even after he has made a number of the appointments that he's made.
Yeah, fun.
But I know what to expect from a Clinton administration.
Well, I do too.
We would be,
That's not what I want.
yeah, that would be fast on the trail to nuclear war.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I have to speak up for the Green Party. Ever since 2000, particularly in Ohio in 2004, the Green Party has been working for recountable paper ballots. I think that's the prime standard for democracy. And what they're asking for now is a recount to prove whether, or to at least to establish what places actually have recountable ballots and which machines are configured so that no recount is available, not even images of the ballots where there are paper ballots.
And that process I would applaud doing.
I do too.
In fact, I would not, although I impugn the Green Party, I don't know whether Jill Stein is acting on behalf of the Green Party or not. It is perfectly clear to anyone who looks at the situation that the electoral process in the United States is corrupt from top to bottom. And it needs to have an accountable electoral system. And although I agree that the Electoral College needs to be abandoned, doing it under the duress of challenging Donald Trump's election is not the time to do it.
The people that I see urging me to write to the electors, the Iowa electors, have nothing to do with the Green Party. So, for what it's worth.
Well, that may be that Jill Stein, in this context, has nothing to do with the Green Party. She may be speaking on behalf, A, of her own opinion, or B, of pressures that are being put upon her. Let me give you an example. The electors are a finite number of human beings. If it was absolutely essential that Hillary Clinton be elected by the Electoral College, do you not believe that the deep state could make X number of offers that could not be refused to the electors? Going back to, what was that movie? An offer that you can't refuse.
Godfather.
Godfather, thank you. That's a finite number of people to whom you can make, look, if they took out Flight 103, if they took out Flight 553, they can make 50 offers that cannot be refused. That's what they need most of all. And this is where the public needs to be aware. What the deep state needs without contradiction is the acquiescence of the 99.99% of the American population. The 99.99% of people who go about their lives, elect, some of them pay attention to politics like Dawn and Janet and the people here. What Thomas Jefferson said, a people who expect to be free and ignorant expect something that never was and never will be. This is our last meeting for 2016, but we'll be reconvened. I'll be here on the 13th of January of 2017.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.